The Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, is warning that government debt is rising at an alarming rate. He's now tabled his midterm budget in Parliament, with Godongwana confirming that the Treasury now sees the economy growing by only 1.1%, and this is down from a previous forecast of 1.3%. Research manager for the Public Economy Project from the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at Wits University, Thoko Madonko, joins us now to unpack this. Thoko, good morning. Often when we think about the nation's debts, the big conversation is, as long as we're able to, service that debt, we should be okay. And when you think comparatively of other economies, even developed economies, they all have massive debt that they have incurred. The thing is, in South Africa, the numbers are just jarring. Yesterday, we heard 388.9 billion rand to service our national debt, and this accounts for every 22 cents in a rand going to the servicing of our debt. Talk to us about your thoughts on the level of South Africa's debt, our ability to sustain it, and whether this is normal.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers. So the important thing to understand about sovereign debt is that it is really premised on growth. So we want sustainable growth, because then the numbers don't really mean much when you are growing your economy, because then you are able to pay back your debt because you will have more money available to you to be able to service that debt. So, currently South Africa's general government debt is approximately at about 5.3 trillion, and it's standing at around 74.7% debt to GDP. And while this is of concern, the current debt level is actually not alarming. Some countries have over 100% GDP, debt to GDP. Japan is huge. The UK, for example, is struggling. The US. And so what makes our debt a little less concerning and a little less of a crisis is that our approximately 90% of our debt is in rands. So we are paying it in our own currency, whereas in other countries like Ghana and Kenya, the bulk of their debt is in US dollars or in foreign currency. And so they're needing to make sure they have enough foreign currency and deal with exchange rate issues, whereas we are lucky in the sense that we have ours denominated in rands. And this is a favorable situation. And South Africa also has a substantial balance sheet. We are a wealthy country. We saw this when they used JAFECRA to be able to create an innovative way of managing our debt portfolio. So the issue here is not debt, it is the economy. And so we have to ask some questions about how sustainable fiscal consolidation, so the current policy that government and the minister tabled again, yet another austerity budget yesterday.
Yeah.
They've been doing this since 2012. And we haven't seen growth. So we have to question the fiscal and monetary policy that's being pursued, and not necessarily the debt in as a worry to the extent that they are making it out to be.
Took a really fascinating opening, so let's unpick some of the things that you've already said. We'll get to fiscal consolidation in just a moment. But when you compare, and you used the UK, you used Japan, these are developed economies. I think that the economic growth in Japan is also quite low, around 1.9%. I speak under correction, so just help me with that if it is the incorrect number. But are we comparing like for like in saying, that we should be sitting and comparing ourselves to these developed economies? And if we think about it, if we think about it, they're doing just as badly as us, in inverted commas, or they have this, similar or higher levels of debt?
So it's important to remember, in the case of Japan, they're also lucky. They have the majority of their debt is also local. So it's their own people who they are borrowing from and paying back. So, wherever there is debt, there's a creditor. So there are people who, and it's the Japanese economy. So it's a good example in that sense, because we have a similar situation where we are leveraging South Africans as the bulk of our domestic borrowing, and also having it in rands. And the big question here is that borrowing in and of itself is not a problem. Countries have done it for millennia. It's part of the political economy of countries. It's how we function. The question is how we leverage that borrowing. And we do have to acknowledge that the state capture years were extremely damaging. And so we have to question some of the nature and form of the debt that we're paying. The second thing is that we need to support global initiatives like the Bridge initiative that is being championed by Barbados, is that we need a global agreement on interest rates pertaining to sovereign debt. South Africa is paying incredibly high interest on its debt compared to developed countries. So, this again disadvantages us because we're having to pay high percentages. So one of the creative things that government could pursue in terms of looking at its debt portfolio is to leverage the Government Employee Pension Fund, which is a big, strong fund that could lower the interest rate so that we have a better rate system. So over time, we're able to pay that debt, but we're also able to meet our developmental needs.
How would that work practically?
So it would be about concessionary loans. So, instead of having at 7.5% interest or above, the prime, we could have it locked in at 3%. This is something that many countries have done in order to boost their own economic activity. And then we look very closely at where that money goes. So we want, which we welcome from the statement yesterday, that we are going to have a focus on infrastructure. The construction industry does create jobs. And so we want to be able to know that we are spending every rand that is going to create more rands. So we want a multiplier effect, and the construction industry and manufacturing help that. But we want to make sure that we're building the right things in the right places and that we don't lose any money. So we need to be able to support the South African Revenue Service, the National Prosecuting Authority. So it's a welcome thing to see money being allocated to these entities who can then be able to play a strong oversight role, including the Auditor General, which is absolutely critical. And so we also need not only physical infrastructure investment, which is a good thing, we also need social infrastructure investment. And we've done some research that shows that just 1% of GDP investment in health, education, and care and social development would create a multiplier effect in the economy by creating jobs, green jobs, mind you. So jobs in the health and education sector are not carbon heavy. And they would then replicate and create jobs for people in the economy. And what we're seeing is an underinvestment in the social infrastructure of this country. Yeah. So we're seeing
it goes back to, if I may, it goes back to what you were saying around fiscal consolidation. And this idea of leaning into austerity, which will do the opposite of all the things you're just saying now. It's the underinvestment in health, underinvestment or inadequate investment in health, inadequate investment in education. So it sounds like the path that we're going on is counterintuitive. Just tell me if you think that is true or not. And also the option that you gave about leveraging the pension fund at a decent, an equitable interest rate sounds like an obvious low-hanging fruit. Why are we not doing these things that seem to be the most practical and most accessible?
So to take it back to the question of austerity, I mean, there's research going back to the 1980s that austerity does not bring about growth. And if you actually read between the lines in the medium policy budget statement, it's clear that they don't even themselves expect to see massive growth. We're a low growth country in our peers, and so we should be doing better. And so what is happening is we're seeing almost government is tying its own hands. It's telling us that this policy that they're pursuing is going to bring about growth, but then at the same time, gross fixed capital assets, which is an indicator of the engine of growth, is going down. And so, they're tying themselves in knots, and it is counterintuitive. On the part of why the low-hanging fruit, I mean, there's always people who benefit from high interest rates, who benefit from the current status quo, who have deep interests in it. And so we need a kind of social compact. And many of my colleagues talk about where is the private sector to come on board and to say we will partner and deal with the developmental needs of South Africa and really invest in South Africa, because we have an investment problem. as well. We don't see the private sector coming to the party to be able to support developmental needs on the ground and to pay decent wages and to make sure that people have decent livelihoods and decent jobs.
Thoko Madonko, Southern Centre for Inequality Studies, thank you very much for stopping by and, in a sense, giving us a tiny mini masterclass there on directions that that South Africa should pursue when it comes to real economic growth as well as inclusive growth. Appreciate your insights this morning.